The night had fallen heavy over the swamp, a thick curtain of blackness suffocating the last remnants of daylight. The trees, gnarled and twisted, loomed over the still waters like skeletal sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. Every inch of the swamp seemed alive with things unseen but undeniably felt. The air was thick, humid, clinging to the skin like damp cloth, and carried with it the pungent stench of decay and rot. A single lantern's weak light flickered in the distance, casting long, trembling shadows on the murky water. It was held by a lone figure, Jared, a man in his early 30s, drawn to this forsaken place by rumors. The locals whispered about a creature, an abomination born of the swamp itself. They spoke in hushed tones of bodies found mutilated, half-devoured, their faces frozen in terror. Some said it was a legend, others swore it was real. Jared didn't believe in stories, at least, not until tonight. He moved carefully, the sucking mud beneath his boots making each step an effort. His breath was shallow, eyes darting between the thick reeds and the dark water. The sounds of the swamp were unnervingly quiet. No croaking frogs, no insects buzzing, only the occasional ripple in the water, as if something large, shifted beneath the surface. A distant splash broke the silence, sending a jolt of fear down his spine. He stopped, straining to see through the dense fog that was creeping over the water. The air grew colder, biting at his exposed skin. His fingers tightened around the handle of the lantern, knuckles white. He wasn't alone. There was a movement in the water, a ripple that stretched unnaturally wide, as if something immense was gliding just below the surface. Jared's heart raced, his mind telling him to turn back, to flee. But the rumors had gnawed at him for weeks. He needed to know what lurked here. He pressed forward, despite the growing dread gnawing at his gut. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound rumbled through the air, a growl, deep and primal, vibrating the very ground beneath his feet. The water nearby bubbled, as though it were boiling, and from it emerged something grotesque. First, Jared saw the hand, if you could call it that. It was a massive clawed appendage, webbed and covered in slimy black muck, its skin wrinkled and leathery like the bark of a drowned tree. It grasped the edge of the bank, pulling a hulking mass from the water. As it rose, the creature's form became clear, towering and hunched, its back covered in jagged, moss-covered spines. Its body was a grotesque mixture of rotting vegetation and pale, bloated flesh, dripping with algae and slime. Its head was worse, a malformed skull with empty, hollow sockets where eyes should have been. Yet Jared felt its gaze fix on him with a cold, predatory hunger. A stench of death, of old, decomposing bodies, hit him like a wave. He gagged, stumbling backward as the creature let out a sound, a wet, sickening gurgle that reverberated through the trees. Jared knew this wasn't a legend. This was real. It was standing right in front of him. The creature moved with terrifying speed for something so large, its long, twisted limbs sloshing through the water with sickening fluidity. Jared turned and ran, his feet slipping in the mud as he sprinted toward the safety of the trees. But he could hear it behind him, the sound of wet limbs dragging across the swamp floor, the gurgling breaths of a predator who knew it had found its prey. Branches whipped at his face as he crashed through the underbrush, lungs burning with the effort. He glanced back, just for a second, and saw the creature lunge. Its mouth, a cavernous maw lined with jagged, uneven teeth, opened impossibly wide as it let out a high-pitched screech that seemed to pierce Jared's very soul. His foot caught on something, a root, a rock, he didn't know. He fell hard, the lantern flying from his hand and smashing into the ground, extinguishing the last bit of light. He was plunged into darkness, the only sounds now his ragged breaths and the squelching approach of the creature. He fumbled in the mud, trying to push himself up, but it was too late. He felt a cold, slimy hand wrap around his ankle, the sharp claws sinking into his flesh. Pain shot up his leg as he screamed, kicking frantically. The creature yanked him back toward the water, dragging him across the mud like a rag doll. Jared's hands clawed at the ground, fingers digging into the wet earth, but the strength of the creature was beyond anything human. He could feel the water now, cold and foul, soaking into his clothes as the creature pulled him closer to the edge. His heart pounded in his chest, panic clawing at his mind. He could feel the creature's breath, hot and fetid, on the back of his neck. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stopped. Jared, half submerged in the freezing water, dared to look back. The creature was still, its head cocked to the side, as if listening to something far off. Its grip on Jared loosened slightly, just enough for him to yank his leg free. He didn't waste a second. Scrambling to his feet, he bolted into the trees, not daring to look back this time. But the creature had let him go. For now, as he ran deeper into the swamp, Jared could still hear the faint, distant growl echoing through the fog, a promise that this wasn't over. Whatever this thing was, it had marked him, and next time, it wouldn't stop. The swamp was alive, and the creature, it was only the beginning. Jared ran without direction, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The swamp seemed endless, a maze of twisted trees and thick, black water. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, feel the sharp burn in his lungs as he pushed himself harder, faster. But no matter how far he ran, the stench of the swamp clung to him, the memory of that thing's slimy hand still burning on his ankle. He slowed to a stop, chest heaving as he leaned against a tree. The world around him was suffocating silent, save for the occasional drip of water falling from leaves into the muck below. He realized he had no idea where he was, where he had come from, or where he was headed. His mind raced, trying to recall the path he had taken, but everything looked the same in this cursed place. He was lost. A soft rustling sound broke the silence, and Jared froze. His eyes darted through the shadows, heart racing once again. Was it following him? Was it watching him from the darkness? His hands trembled as he reached into his jacket for the hunting knife he had brought. The blade felt useless in his grip, tiny compared to the monstrosity he had seen. Still, it was the only defense he had. The rustling grew louder, closer, and Jared's pulse quickened. He pressed himself against the tree, his breath shallow, every instinct screaming at him to run again. But he couldn't. His body wouldn't move. The sound was almost on top of him now, coming from the thick underbrush just a few feet away. Then, silence. For a long moment, Jared dared not breathe, his eyes wide, straining to see through the darkness. His mind raced, imagining the creature lurking just out of sight, waiting to pounce. He gripped the knife tighter, feeling sweat trickling down his neck. A sudden flash of movement, something small and quick darted across the path in front of him. He flinched, his heart skipping a beat, but it wasn't the creature. A possum scurried into the shadows, its beady eyes reflecting in the dim moonlight before it disappeared. Jared let out a shaky breath, but his relief was short-lived. The swamp felt wrong, like it was alive in ways it shouldn't be. The creature had left him, yes, but why? It had him in its grasp, could have torn him apart, devoured him whole. But something had stopped it. What had it heard? Or worse, what had called it away? The thought twisted in his mind, gnawing at him. There was more to this swamp than just the creature. There had to be. Jared's gut churned with unease. He had to keep moving, had to find a way out of this nightmare. Pushing himself off the tree, Jared stumbled forward, moving cautiously now, eyes darting between the trees. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every sound felt like a warning. He had to stay alert. The swamp was treacherous, and the thing, whatever it was, could be lurking anywhere. He came to a clearing, where the water pooled in a large, still pond. The surface was black, a perfect mirror reflecting the distorted trees above. Jared hesitated at the edge, unsure of what to do. Something about the water was deeply unsettling, like it wasn't just water at all but something far darker, far older. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed something odd, a cluster of pale, bloated shapes floating just beneath the surface. His stomach twisted as he realized what they were. Bodies. Human bodies, half submerged in the muck, their faces twisted in frozen agony. Limbs protruded at odd angles, bones snapped, flesh gnawed away by something. Jared stumbled backward, the bile rising in his throat. He knew those faces, people from the nearby towns who had gone missing over the last few weeks. He hadn't believed the stories. Not until now. The realization hit him hard. The creature was feeding on them, on anyone unlucky enough to wander too deep into the swamp. And it had nearly claimed him. But something was different about these bodies. As he stared in horror, he noticed strange markings carved into their skin, symbols he didn't recognize. They weren't random. They were deliberate, ritualistic. Jared's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a creature. Something, or someone, was controlling it. The thought chilled him to the bone. Who could wield such a monstrous force? And why? A low hum began to vibrate in the air, barely perceptible at first, but growing steadily louder, like the distant droning of bees. Jared's skin prickled with unease. He glanced around, eyes wide, searching for the source. But the sound seemed to be coming from everywhere, echoing through the trees, rising from the water itself. Then the ground beneath his feet trembled. Jared stumbled, nearly falling into the pond as the earth shuddered. The water rippled violently, the bodies swirling, sinking back into the depths. The hum grew louder, vibrating through his bones. And then, rising from the center of the pond, something else emerged. A figure, draped in long, tattered robes of black and green, stepped from the water as though walking on solid ground. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but Jared could feel its gaze burning through him, cold and malevolent. In its hand, it held a staff, twisted and gnarled like the roots of the swamp itself. And from the staff hung something, a mass of dripping, pulsing flesh, veined and alive. The figure raised the staff, and the humming ceased. Jared's heart slammed in his chest, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The figure spoke, its voice low and guttural, the words twisting in the air like smoke. "You were spared," it rasped, "for a reason." The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Jared felt the weight of the swamp closing in around him, suffocating. He had ventured too far. This was no longer just a creature's domain. It was something much, much worse. And now, he was part of it. The figure's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jared stood frozen, the weight of the swamp crushing him from all sides. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the robed figure standing impossibly atop the water, its staff pulsing with something unnatural, something alive. The realization that he was no longer just prey but part of something far darker gnawed at the edges of his sanity. The figure took a step forward, the water beneath it parting like a wound in the earth, and Jared's instinct screamed at him to flee. But his legs were locked, heavy as lead, rooted to the spot by an unseen force. The humming had stopped, but in its place, a silence had descended, a silence so profound that it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. "You should have left when the water warned you," the figure whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. Jared's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He had no idea what this thing meant by "the water warned him," but it didn't matter now. All that mattered was surviving. He needed to move, to run, to escape the grip of this nightmare. The figure raised its staff higher, the twisted, vein mass at its tip throbbing in rhythm with the pounding of Jared's heart. "You've seen it, haven't you?" the figure continued. "The creature of the swamp. It devours the unworthy, the foolish who wander too close." Its voice was dripping with contempt, as if Jared's very presence here was an offense. "But you were spared. It marked you." Jared's eyes widened as he instinctively touched his ankle where the creature had grabbed him. A burning sensation spread from the spot, crawling up his leg, and when he lifted his pant leg, he saw it, a grotesque mark, like a brand, etched into his skin. It resembled the symbols carved into the bodies floating in the water. Terror gripped him. He thought he had escaped the creature, but it had left a piece of itself with him, something far worse than death. "What do you want from me?" Jared finally managed to choke out, his voice trembling. His hand still clutched the knife, though it now felt absurdly useless against the overwhelming force in front of him. The figure cocked its head slightly, as if amused by the question. "You were brought here for a reason. The swamp calls to those it desires. You were chosen." Jared's heart sank. Asterisk chosen? Asterisk for what? Before he could form another question, the figure stretched out a bony hand from beneath its tattered robe. Its fingers were long and gnarled, their skin slick with the same oily substance that covered the creature. Jared felt a pressure building in his skull, a piercing pain that made his vision blur. The surrounding air seemed to thicken, growing denser, heavier. You carry the seed of the swamp now, the figure said, its voice rising with a malevolent glee. It will grow inside you, twist your body and soul until you become part of the earth beneath your feet, part of the water you tread on. You will be like the others, forever bound to the swamp. Jared shook his head, stumbling backward, his body convulsing with panic. He couldn't comprehend the horror of what was being said. Asterisk part of the swamp. Asterisk his mind rejected the thought, but deep down, he felt it. Something inside him asterisk was asterisk changing. He could feel the pull of the swamp in his veins, in his bones, as if it was already consuming him from the inside out. No, no, he shouted, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. He turned and ran, his legs finally obeying him, tearing through the muck and reeds with desperate speed. His mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline, thoughts crashing into each other like waves in a storm. The figure's voice followed him, echoing through the trees, growing louder as if it were inside his head. You cannot escape, it whispered. The swamp is in you now. It will asterisk always asterisk find you. Jared pushed harder, running faster than he ever thought possible, his feet pounding the earth as the trees blurred past him. He didn't know where he was going. He just had to get away. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his vision began to tunnel, the world closing in as exhaustion gripped him. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Then, just as his legs threatened to give out, he saw it, a clearing up ahead. Beyond it, the trees parted to reveal a narrow path leading out of the swamp. Relief flooded his chest, hope flickering like a fragile flame in the darkness. Asterisk escape. Asterisk he could see it. He could almost taste the fresh air, feel the solid ground beneath his feet. He was going to make it, but as he reached the edge of the clearing, something shifted beneath him. The ground trembled, and suddenly, the earth itself opened up beneath his feet. Jared screamed as he plunged into the muck, his body sinking fast into the thick, black mud. He clawed at the ground, his fingers sinking into the soft, wet earth. But there was no solid ground to grasp, only the swamp, pulling him down. The more he struggled, the faster he sank. The cold, wet grip of the swamp wrapped around him, dragging him deeper and deeper into its murky depths. He screamed again, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence. His body was now submerged up to his chest, and the weight of the swamp was crushing him, squeezing the air from his lungs. As the mud rose higher, creeping up his neck, Jared looked up one last time, his eyes wide with terror. Standing at the edge of the pit, watching him with cold indifference, was the figure. The hood had fallen back now, revealing a face, if it could even be called that. It was a grotesque mask of decay, half human, half swamp, its skin fused with roots and vines, its mouth a gaping hole of rot and moss. "This is your fate," the figure said, its voice a soft hiss. "You belong to the swamp now." Jared's vision blurred as the mud closed over his mouth, then his nose. He thrashed weakly, his body sinking deeper into the cold, wet embrace of the earth. His last breath escaped in a wet gurgle, and then he was gone, swallowed whole by the swamp. The surface of the mud stilled, leaving no trace of Jared behind. The figure turned, disappearing back into the trees as the swamp fell silent once more, its ancient hunger sated. But deep beneath the surface, the swamp whispered. It was not done. There would be others. There were always more.